very much. So yes, to those of you who are wondering how to pronounce my last name, it's Karjalainen. So I'm going to be talking about the impacts on public services and public finances more generally, which is basically what we tend to think about at the IFS. So we've already kind of got a bit of a background from Jumana and others on this, but aging presents challenges for fiscal sustainability, both because when we have more older people, we're going to spend more on the state pension, on healthcare, on social care, but also with the falling fertility rates, we basically have less working age people who then pay less tax. So we have these reduced tax revenues as well, which then really make this create more of these pressures. I'm actually going to start with the polling question before I get into any of this, any of my presentation. I want to hear, before you hear any of my presentation, what do you think the government should lean on the most to alleviate the pressures on public finances from an aging population? And I'll explain these options to you while you can scan the code and pick your answer. So the first two have to do with cutting the state pension by either increasing the state pension age or reducing the level or future level. Then we have reducing NHS spending, social care spending, or other types of spending, and then increasing taxes. Now, you might say, I want to do all of them, or some combination of them, which is a fair and totally the sensible answer. But I'd like to hear, before we get started, what is the most important thing that you think we should be focusing on right now? Of course, I don't have growth there, which is what Rachel Reeves is talking about right now. But I mean, that would fix a lot of the issues. But let's see what people are saying. Okay, so this is really interesting. People obviously have strong views on the state pension, both the state pension age and the triple lock, and then a little bit less on these other options. All right. Well, I think this is really nice to keep in mind while I'm going through the presentation, and we can. Basically, the idea of this question was to get you thinking a little bit about the trade-offs here. What are the kind of things that the government has to be thinking about when they're choosing what to focus on? I'm not going to ask this question again, but maybe you can think, would my answer change? Given my presentation, we'll see. And of course, if you have any questions on any of these options, or you want to come up with your own options, I'd be really happy to have those discussions during the Q&A. All right, but let's get started with the actual presentation. So again, we've seen some of these types of graphs already, but I'll just show my own version of what's happening to demographics and why is it that we're facing these public finance challenges in the future. So this chart shows for the UK the proportion of the population that is over the age, adult population that is over the age of 65. That's the green line here. And you can see that it started rising since 2010 as the baby boomer generation started hitting that age 65. But what I think is really interesting is that if you're looking at the proportion of the population that is above the state pension age, so actually receiving the state pension, that is at the moment lower than it was, for example, in 2010, because we've seen big increases in the state pension age, first for women and then for both men and women. And actually, it's only in the 2030s that we're starting to see the proportion of the population that's over the state pension age rising. Now, if you then shift this green line kind of 20 years to the right in your head, then you can see that it's also in the 2030s that we expect to see this proportion of people over the age of 85 starting to rise. And that's, of course, the people who are going to need more social care and so on. So I think, this is just to illustrate that a lot of these demographic pressures are really going to hit us in the next decade or so, or start hitting us in the next decade. And we can then see that when it comes to public finance as spending and projections. So what I'm showing here is what the OBR thinks that we're going to be spending on pensions, pensioner benefits, health and long-term care as a percentage of GDP or national income. Now, personal spending on pensions at the moment and pensioner benefits is about 5.6%. That's projected to rise to 7.3% by the 2050s and then 8.9% by the 2070s. So these are large increases. But actually, I think it's always worth keeping in mind that when it comes to the aging population, healthcare is also a really big part of spending. of course, it's already a big part of spending, but also the kind of in relative terms, the rise in healthcare spending is we're expecting to be larger than it is for pension spending, and also long-term care, of course, plays a role here. But maybe here, I think people were highlighting that we need to do something about the state pension when it comes to dealing with the aging population, but actually in terms of magnitude, it's the healthcare spending that's even bigger. But essentially, the aging population puts pressures on public finances. So what can the government do about this? What are some of the kind of policy responses that we could be thinking about? And I'll first talk about the two options that are already outlined, so the state pension age increase and the triple lock. So because those are the kind of policy levers that can be pulled to restrict the increasing public pension system costs. Now, of course, we could also restrict eligibility in some ways, but that's not. I'm not going to be talking too much about that today. But the point that I want to make here around the triple lock, around state pension age increases, is that the different policies and different ways in which we decide to cut spending on the state pension will have different distributional effects. Essentially, maintaining the triple lock and relying only on state pension age increases to manage costs of the state pension system is going to hit those with a lower life expectancy, such as poor people, more. And that's a lot of words in that one bullet point, so I'm just going to explain that a little bit more with a graph as well. So essentially the two options that we're considering here is increasing the state pension age from the current 66 to 67. That's already going to start happening actually next year, but if we're kind of thinking about this hypothetical scenario today. And then we're going to think about the other policy option is going from triple lock to earnings indexation. Now, the triple lock means that every year the state pension increases in line with 2.5% average earnings growth or inflation, whichever of those three is the highest. Earnings indexation just means that every year we increase the level of the state pension in line with earnings. So of course that means that then in the future we expect the state pension to be lower under earnings indexation than under the triple lock. Now, both of these policy changes are going to have a negative effect on the amount of wealth or income that people can expect to receive from the state in retirement. And that's what I'm going to be showing here is the impact of these two policy changes on people's expected state pension income over time based on their wealth quintiles. So first of all, if you're in the middle of the wealth distribution, and we take away 1 year of the state pension in the first year of your retirement, that's going to have a similar effect on the expected amount that you're going to get from the state over your retirement, as is going from the triple lock to earnings indexation. The way that we've calculated the kind of relative effect here is that we take people in their mid-60s, we assume that they're going to they all get the full new state pension, and then we apply their life expectancy, which here is going to be different based on your wealth levels, and then we discount those future cash flows and get their expected state pension wealth or the state pension income. So for the people in the middle of the income distribution, these two policies actually have a pretty similar effect, around 5% reduction in the level of income that you can expect to receive. If we then look at the effects of the increase in the state pension age across the wealth distribution, you can see that because the poorest 20% of the population have a lower life expectancy, taking away that first year of its retirement income is going to be a bigger hit to as a proportion of their overall expected income over time. Now, if we then look at the option of going from triple lock to earnings indexation, actually that's going to be a bigger hit for the richest 20% of people. And that's because it's those richest people who are going to be living longer, who are going to be able to benefit from the triple lock, that future higher level of the state pension for longer. So basically, that's just to illustrate the distributional impacts of these two different policies. And I think it's really something that we need to keep in mind, and something that sometimes is missing from the conversation is when we're thinking about these different policies. Now, we know these policy levers for public pensions or the state pension, but I think it's fair to say that for the levers that we have for limiting public health spending are a lot less clear cut. If we're thinking about for example, increasing the state pension age today, that's going to have a saving to the government today. However, when we're thinking about how are you going to restrict spending on the NHS, a lot of the things that come up in conversation are things like we could increase the productivity of the NHS, we can focus more on preventative healthcare and so on. But those are things that are going to have a certain upfront cost. And then these savings in the future, there's a lot more uncertainty around that and about the kind of timeline over which we're going to see those benefits. Of course, we could do things like just cut NHS services, but as our poll showed, and I think if you polled the public, that's going to be, would also show, that's going to be politically incredibly difficult to do. But as we've already mentioned, you know, the other options, if we're not going to cut things around pensions or public health or health spending, we're going to have to either cut spending elsewhere or raise taxes or borrow more, which essentially means deferring these choices to a later stage. Now, in the last few minutes of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened at the autumn budget. Now, this might seem like forever ago. You know, I guess in a political cycle, it was a long time ago, and there's a big speech today. But I still think it's worth reflecting on what actually happened at this key fiscal event, or our last key fiscal event. So when it comes to these topics around the pension system and the kind of topics that we're talking about today, we did see some pretty small changes to private pensions at the autumn budget. Pension pots are now subject to inheritance tax, which they weren't previously. And we also have higher employer NICs, which basically increase the generosity of the relief on employer contributions. There was also a lot of speculation of what might happen. So there was conversations around maybe the government was going to limit the amount of money that you can take out of your pension tax-free, but that didn't actually happen at the end. Now, I think, again, it's fair to say that there were no large-scale measures to actually address these public finance challenges arising due to aging. You know, that we saw some small changes to this private pension treatment, but there wasn't any kind of large-scale measures that we saw. You might think, well, I mean, there was a lot of talk about winter fuel payments. What about winter fuel payments? I think this is an example of where there was a lot of conversation around this. It's very, people feel very strongly about it. There was a lot of media coverage, but the government spent £151 billion on state pension and pensioner benefits last year. Winter fuel payments were £2 billion out of that. The saving that the government expects to get is about £1.5 billion. So again, that's 1% of that total benefit spending. So maybe the kind of, you know, it was shown to us as a big trade-off, a very important, difficult decision, which it, you know, ended up being. But in terms of the magnitude of that policy change, it was relatively small. Now, of course, it's easier to criticize the governments and their budget. So let's think a little bit about what could good policy actually look like. Now, this is nothing new, but I think a key issue with budgets and this kind of parliamentary cycle in general is that the budget deals with issues in the next 5 years and not beyond. And the kind of topics that we're talking about here, these are issues that we're really going to start seeing in the next 10, 20, 30 years and so on. So what I think good policy would look like is basically policy that applies reforms based on a clear set of principles to ensure stability. I actually think that's what Rachel Reeves is trying to do today, is kind of setting a scene, setting these kind of principles and a framework for why we need to make some difficult choices. Whether they manage to do that, we'll see. But I think this kind of long-term view is something that's really going to help government make difficult decisions. Now, it might sound like a pipe dream or kind of like too idealistic, but there was an example of this in the early 2000s when we had the Pensions Commission. So this was a commission that was set up by the government that came up with recommendations for how we should reform the pension system. And after that commission, because they had built a political consensus behind those recommendations, the government was able to make really bold policy choices, introducing automatic enrollment, introducing a flat rate pension, state pension, and so on. And successive governments followed those recommendations because it had set the scene and kind of, it was a piece of work that built that consensus as they were putting it together. So I think there is a precedent for this. And I think that's the kind of policy setting that we need to see when it comes to these long-term issues in this country.